morning. It's really a pleasure to be here among friends. Some of you I know will become friends, some are old friends. And I should begin by thanking IFA and the team here. It is a real honor to be here amongst you. And thank you especially to Arundhati for inviting me to give this keynote. And of a conference, the theme of which is very, very close to my heart. When I completed my PhD and returned to India in 1993, for a while I had no job. For a few months, I was given the opportunity to work as what was called a research officer at CSSC, where I worked on the digitization of Bengali periodicals at the Bungyo Sahitya Parishad Library. Now, I had worked in archives before, but that was when I was trying to be a historian. Now, this was a different experience, and I was completely engrossed in this, because for the first time, I was looking at journals that were in Musulmani Bangla, not Bangla that I was aware of. It was in such a delicate state that we had to have them copied by hand before they could be microfilmed. So this was fascinating, and I felt then, and I felt very strongly that we had this need to build archives of a wide range of institutions in contemporary India that would enable historians and those of us who are interested in archives to work in new areas. And we needed interpretations of post-independent India. And rather than, be shackled to analyzing the colonial past. So for which you needed to keep going to the India Office Library and records or the British Library. Now this innocent dream, as I call it, was rather simplistic. But there were no funders, and even if people listened, they thought this was a ridiculous idea, and as a historian, I could do better things with my time. More than 2 decades later, it is wonderful to be among all of you who have created a path where archivists and historians can walk together, where perhaps they could also share authority. But I'll come to this again later, because the archivist is within that hierarchy, the archivist doesn't feature. As a historian, I was trained to study the colonial archives at the India Office Library and Records, at British Library, the State Archives of West Bengal, National Archives of India, and the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, as one of my friends here reminded me that that's where we first met. Now, these institutions were standard sites of pilgrimage for any history student doing a PhD. The archives served a purpose, and though as a generation, we were becoming aware that the contents of any archive had, and in some elusive way did not have, all the elements that made up our past, still, we were taught to deconstruct and interpret the reports, the records, the correspondence memos, and present that foreign country, as L.P. Hartley famously called it, as a near accurate representation of what the past was like. But the past was also embedded in the stories I had heard at home. And we go to the next slide, please. The colonial archive never acknowledged the archive of human experience that we carry within us, a sense of uselessness that was assigned to the experience of the colonized and the values that they held close, which would often be hard to translate into the Western framework, devalued the family archive, and resulted in what was already incomplete and fragmentary to lose its legitimacy. And yet, it is an archive we carry within us through the stories we grew up with. And here I want to say something that I have put, few names who have inspired me. You not always see their quotes, but these people have really made me think of archiving in certain ways. And the question here is, what do our experiences say about us? Next slide, please. I grew up in a small town called Bengaluru in eastern India. It's a steel factory town. And along with my cousins, we saw Bengaluru as what we called our Desh, which only drew laughter from the elders who saw such declarations as a joke, because the elders were constantly talking about their Desh. And we said, where is our Desh? Our Desh is here, it's in the steel factory. And they never believed us for a moment. For after all, they said, we were from Mekuta, our grandfather's village near Nobinagar by the banks of the Titash, or we were from Kumilla, where my grandmother's father continued to live until his death in 1965. We were told that we were not refugees, quote unquote, but people who had worked in that factory town for more than a decade before the partition, drew a line separating them from their home or their Deshibai. Ours was a joint family. Next slide, please. And I grew up, next slide, Rivka. And I grew up with my uncles and aunts, and you can see some of my aunts there and cousins, with countless stories which invited us to imagine a past that was very difficult to relate to. As a teenager, I had quite accidentally conducted a very short interview with my great-grandmother who lived with us, and that is Bidumoti, who you see right at the corner. I was trying to do a test recording on a brand new tape recorder that my uncle, who was visiting from the UK, had brought back. Our great-grandmother, Bidumoti, had recollected her childhood and how she loved to watch the travelling theatre, the Jatra performances in her village. She even sang an amusing song about the foppish men of colonial Kolkata, the Kolkata Babu as she called them, who used pomatum or pomade on his hair. More than 2 decades later, while doing my PhD research, to my stunned delight, I would discover the words of a song in a 19th century Bengali songbook in the India Office Library in London. I regretted not paying more attention to what she had said. I could not revisit her narrative either, because we had not preserved that recording. At that point, as I struggled to become a historian, in the debates between history and memory, history always emerged triumphant. I was never taught to value memory, and so the significance of my great-grandmother's story escaped me. Next slide, please. Much later, I interviewed my grandmother's sister in Kolkata. And she was the one who alerted me to the way in which the border on the eastern side after partition remained quite porous. In fact, she had gone and spent a year with her parents, my grandmother's parents, who continued living there. My great-grandfather refused to move to India because he said he was at home and he saw no reason to move to Kolkata. And, they actually would visit Kumilla quite regularly. I myself have been there in '64. I don't have too much of a memory of the house. But, and I've tried to write about this. But it is during the war of 1965 that the border closed. And it became impossible for this family to visit their age or even meet with grandparents. And I think this was a very strange beginning to my interview with my father's aunt, Indira Chowdhury, who, when I asked her the usual question at the beginning of her interview, when were you born? And she says, 30th July was my birthday. And I remember feeling completely taken back. What do you mean was your birthday? You're born, it remains your birthday. And then she says, but from 1966, it became the day my father died. So she can no longer think of that date as a birthday. And then this regret is something that I realized that the family just held very close, that they had thought that they will go there to be with him when he falls very ill and becomes infirm. But here was a war that just prevented them from visiting him. So I asked about letters that he wrote, and she said yes, he would write to us, but he would write to a relative in Vienna, and then that relative would post the letter to Kolkata, and it took about 21 days for news to travel between what was otherwise a very short distance. But what happened, what was quite tragic, is after my great-grandfather's death, my great-grandmother started having a very hard time because one of the relatives sold the land around, started selling portions of the house, and didn't give her any money, and it became very, very difficult. So she actually came to India in the 1970s, and through the Dashama border. And there's another story about how they went, and you still couldn't give, you had to pay the money at the border to their government in Pakistani rupees. And how do you do that if you're not allowed to, exchange your money? So, there are stories of how they stood there waiting and how somebody else helped. So this is a photograph of, my lucky cousin who's actually photographed with the family in Kumilla. She's my aunt actually, that young girl. And I can't believe that he didn't take a picture of me, because my great-grandfather was a great one for taking photographs. But I realized the year I went, the borders closed soon after that. And possibly nobody could bring back that picture. Now, the people you see here are my great-grandfather's widowed sister. To the left, my great-grandfather. And right behind him is Madhavi, his daughter, and her daughter standing next to him. His son, and then his wife, my great-grandmother. And at the back, the four women you see are all my aunts who were professionals. The Reva Peshi, she worked in the Employment Exchange. Madhavi, who was the only card-holding CPM member, she actually worked in the telephone exchange. Then his second daughter was a teacher in Sindri in the fertilizer complex. And my aunt, that is his granddaughter, to the extreme right, that is my Vishnu, she was a teacher, school teacher in Bengaluru. So they all felt that we were working, so we shall, not call ourselves refugees, but we actually will have the resources to go there, but they could not. And I think this is a picture from '64, and I think I visited shortly afterwards, and of which there are no records, except my father's passport, which has a stamp saying we went there. Now, I want to the next slide actually is Lavonna Prabha, my aunt's album. This was her personal album. And I want to draw attention to this interesting way in which she's put the photographs there. She has her grandparents right at the center. But look at the people around. There is Subhash Bose, there is Jawaharlal Nehru, Chittaranjan Das, there is Ramakrishna Paramahansa, and of course the two writers, Sharat Chandra and Rabindranath. And around, you can't see it very well, are landscapes of Kumilla and all the places that she saw as the place of her ancestor. And I found this very, very moving when I found this album, that this was the first page of her album. People she couldn't visit land she couldn't go to, and the figures she was inspired by. And we move to the next slide. And I want to now come to the different ways by which people remember Desh. If photographs was one, in our family, there were certain trees that were planted in our Burnpur house that recollected their home that was in Kumudra, that was in Merkuta. But this is a fairly common way in which that generation tried to commemorate Desh and tried to revisit it. So, revisiting Desh also happened through practices, through rituals, through artisanal work that is done with one's hand. And Shumita Vishwash, who lives down this road actually, Ponjanamgram, and where I had interviewed her, she makes a living out of creating katha embroidered cloth. She is not born in Bangladesh, what is now Bangladesh. No, she's born here near Gutiari Sharif. She's born in India. And, she says that her parents had settled there in Gutiari Sharif after partition. She's now a resident of this village, which actually a lot of them, she's made a little group that makes these kanthas. Shumita speaks of the history of her craft, linking it to districts of what is now Bangladesh. Since she's born on this side of the border, I'm surprised by the familiarity with which she recounts a relatively recent phenomenon in India and Bangladesh. It began more than a decade after the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, where kantha embroidery becomes a part of ethnic chic. Otherwise, earlier, kantha is really something that you have at home, you wrap yourself in it, on a winter's day, you wrap it around your body, but it's not something that is fashionable to wear, it's not a wearable that you take outside. And these new products, scarves, stoles, bedspreads, were made for commercial consumption by craft NGOs on both sides of the border. Shumita's recollection, and I put recollection in quotes because these are not her memories, of how the craft was practiced in villages of what is now Bangladesh, alerts us to the replication of memory and nostalgia, not her own. These stories, which she recounts, belong to the oral culture of nostalgia that her parents and the larger extended family participated. Indeed, it is not unusual for Bengalis who are on the Indian side to identify with the villages and localities that the previous generation had left behind. Endless repetition about the villages left behind brings a life for Shumita's generation, a rural life that she, by virtue of living close to Kolkata, cannot hope to possess. Shumita consolidates the family memory as she speaks about the craft she now practices in another space, indeed in another country, and in another time and completely different context. It is a memory community that she is surrounded by, and that is what makes this very possible for her. And she vocalizes those memories, and in fact even augments them. So I asked her, where did you get to hear about all this? Did you hear this from your family, from your aunt? And she says, yes, from my mother and father. All of them were from Bangladesh. She calls it still Bangladesh, though they came earlier. They told you these stories. She said, yeah. And she says, there are many people in this area who know about this. And this is very interesting because she says, even today, if you cross the bypass to the other side, you'll find almost 80% are from Bangladesh. And later she says, I don't want to talk about it because this is like really talking about something dangerous because they haven't come during partition. They've come later. but they bring with them these memories that has nurtured the memory she had grown up with. So she also, as she recollects, she also recounts and conceals another subterranean stream of memory, what cannot be spoken about in front of strangers, but can be articulated within a community that understands that migrants still cross the border to find work and build a life. It is this community that keeps memory alive and gives meanings to stories. And by extension, it is this memory community that keeps an unseen landscape alive. Next slide, please. So, I think, till we never talked about partition till Urvashi started writing about the partition and what it meant. Ritu Kumar, Urvashi, all of them began to open up what had been an area of silence. And I think, as she rightly says, that this was not just a division of territory, it was a division of hearts. And I think by that she means that people were very deeply affected. But I think there was much more than just, the Hindu-Muslim relationship. It was really about leaving your home behind, which, you cannot find that home anywhere else. And I think what it also alerts us to, the way the partition stories came up, and it opened up a whole range of feelings about what people would do to defend themselves, how would they look at their neighbor, how would they look at another community, because it actually alerts us to something that is happening all the time when we work with memory. Next slide, please. So, this is from Raphael Samuel, who never really looked at India or the partition, but looked at working class men. And he says, if history is an arena for the projection of ideals, it can also be a means of undoing and questioning them, offering more disturbing accounts of who we are and where we come from than simple identification would suggest. So, in other words, it is much more complex than just saying, I'm a refugee, I'm from that side of the border. It is really a whole complex of feelings. With that, I want to come to the next moment of my thoughts on archives and museums, where I want to talk a bit about decolonizing our approach to archives and museums. And here, there are very different inspirations. One is Merata Mita, who is from New Zealand. The other are my two architect friends. Unfortunately, we've lost Anu and Anu. And I think I will make clear why I take this as an inspiration to understand our relationship to colonial archives and museums. I'll begin with Happy Mita, who is Merata's son, who starts making this archival film, or rather starts editing the films that his mother shot. And the name of this film was How Mom Decolonized the Screen. And it is just a fantastic sort of film. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but what he says is, my mother once said, what you see when you see an archival film are resurrections taking place. A past life lives again, and something from the heart, the spirit, responds. And Merata was one of the first Maori filmmakers, and she later in her life had taught in Hawaii. And I think, the film actually has footage which is about Maori protests of people trying to say, you cannot define us in this way. And I felt it really helped me think through some of the things that one comes across at times. So I want to briefly revisit again something in the city that I worked on, which is the Indian Museum. And this is actually a photograph of a moment that we will never see the frontage of the museum ever again. And I think because of the flyover that is in front of it. So you will not see this grand frontage. Next slide, please. But I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about the gallery that is called the Evolution of Man. Now, if I look at this gallery, I think what I'm trying to ask is, how do we relate to this past? This is the story of Nihu Angami, who you see right at the left. This Evolution of Man gallery, of course now all Evolution of Man galleries and museums, including the one in Manipal, has the DNA right at the center. It's so scientific. But we are going to begin, what I want to signal at is that it's all right to have the DNA there, but if the rest of your approach does not change, you actually end up replicating something in the name of science which is quite colonial. So these are heads of different tribal groups that were made by an artist. And I want to again make another point about the Indian Museum, which is that this museum is the classic museum that is an encyclopedic museum. It has different sections. So there is the anthropology section, there is the art section, the botany section, there is also archaeology and zoology. So that is the way in which the museum was organized when it became the Indian Museum, because it was a really much more random collections when it was in the Asiatic Society. Then it moved. Now, what is interesting here is these heads were commissioned by the Anthropological Survey of India, but they were made by an artist, and let's move on. They were made by Margaret Milward, and that is her book, An Artist in India. Now, Margaret Milward had spent time in Tagore Shantiniketan. She had also gone around India, including, spent time with Villiers Elwin and talked to a range of tribal people and had them sit for her. And she was an artist who was trained by Baudel, who was a student of Rodin. So, she came from that lineage. And so, you often wonder what was happening here. So she talks about Nihu, who's an Angami from the Kohima settlement, who had worked for the British for 20 years. And he's a grand old man who was so rigidly and so well that he made me ache and sympathy. Now she has all the details about Nihu here in her book. And, he's the head interpreter, but he's also into cultivation. He's an agriculturalist. Now, when we were doing this book for the Indian Museum, and I wanted to talk about this head of Nihu Angami, and I was introducing that section by saying, there sits this head, robbed, Nihu Angami, robbed of his history. And the museum was shocked. I said, what do you mean? How can you talk like this? You cannot accuse us of robbing someone of their history. I said, but what is he here? No, can you not see that this is the genetic diversity of India that we are trying to portray? I said, true, but it still doesn't tell us about his history. Next slide. Next slide. This is the part of the memorandum that Nihu Angami signed when the Simon Commission came to India. To say that, our country is poor. By our country, he doesn't mean the whole of India, but he means his area. And, if we are placed under the reform scheme, we are afraid of the taxes. We will soon start selling our lands. And then, of course, he says, we will not have our customary laws. So I'll not read this out, but this was his This was one of the things he signed. Now, you have no indication that Mehwan Gandhi is a real person, that he was part of this particular petition. And of course, the museum's argument is this is commissioned by the Anthropological Survey of India. It is about the genetic landscape. Why do you want to bring this in? Now, they have no good reason not to put in the historical there, but it is a part of, finding an encyclopedic museum and finding a niche for everything, finding little slots for everything. And that is what has happened here, that he is left in this particular space, like this. And that is how it's displayed. So Bharatvarsh genetic politician. So it is only that. There is no more that you hear about. So, when as an archivist I was consulting with the museum to create this book for their 200 years, they did have a say, so therefore in the editorial part of that section, this bit had to be taken off, which really made me feel very upset. I said, well, can there be other ways? And of course, as most of us who worked as curators know, you always find a way. And so, can I have the next slide? I decided that I will use the oral history of Mark Elliott, who's worked with these heads, to make the same point and make something beyond that, where he says that actually there is no reason for this to be only in an anthropological section. We should start looking at these as hybrid objects. Why must the object only be anthropological or archaeological? Can it not be an object that speaks across these disciplines? And that's why too, I want to end the section with my other inspiration, that is Dilip Ananu, and this is from Dilip's book, which is called, next slide please, which is called The Invention of Rivers, Alexander's Eye and Ganga's Descent. Dilip and Anu had found that this division between land and water, the moment you make this line, you draw this artificial line, you are actually not understanding your past. You have drawn that line and you say, this is the river, this is the land, and then you're not able to explain things. So what they say instead is that here is a way that Indians have always lived in this wetness. There are rains, it's wet. Water needs to be absorbed by the earth before it can flow. It is wet, it is mushy. That is what defines that area. That is what people see, not that line that says this is the river and this is the land. And this helped me think, this quotation is really an inspiration of how we can look at that smudgy, blurry arena of knowledge through a different imagination, rather than channels of knowledge that flow along the specified channels of the disciplines. That landscape, where it rains and blurs the lines between art and anthropology, between history and memory, between all branches of knowledge that contain elements of the past, is what we need to understand and celebrate. So decolonization would look at all those elements as existing together in wholeness, and dare I say, in messiness. So there has to be that messiness. It can't be the way it is now. Can we move to the next slide, please? Now here too, I'm glad to see one of the inspirations here sitting with us, wisdom. But I think I've learned a lot from all this. I myself identify today as an oral historian who enjoys nothing better than to talk to people and find out, what was that past like. So let's move on and say why this is important. And it's important to recognize that oral history is oral. Oral history is not something that writing does. To really understand that, we have to say that we are looking at the volume, the way people talk, their expression, their tone, none of which will be present in the transcription. That's why it requires listening again and again. And I think, Rustam, in your book on Rajasthan, when you start talking about what Komandan really meant as you listened, and as the meaning sort of unraveled when you were listening, not when you were reading something out, I began to see that that's what we need to do all the time, that listening becomes the skill, the way in which we can listen and understand what is being said. So to really understand the role oral history plays in India, we need to move away from a current understanding that I often hear historians repeat, that we filled in the gaps. You fill in no gaps. You get something completely new. You get something very rich and very different. And I encounter this often. And I feel that when we speak about reinserting accent voices into history, we must remember that these voices are marked by cultures of orality and memory that cannot be translated into writing. These cultures are very, very different. So we move to one application that we see in the Remember Bhopal Museum, which was the brainchild of Rama Lakshmi, who is a journalist and an oral historian, and Shalini Sharma, who is an activist and academic, who actually studies human resilience in the face of environmental disasters. So at one level, what they do is they start talking to people about their experience of that night, of what happened, and their experience of suffering. So this is one way where they try to talk about, this experience is not talked about. So let's, present it. And of course, there are lots of school children in Bhopal for whom even that disaster has become a space that is silenced. No one talks about it anymore. So when they come to this museum of the survivors, they begin to hear what had happened that night in their very neighborhood. But I want to turn to a similar attempt, but to demonstrate to you that this one actually needs the video, because I'm going to play this. This is an attempt made by Nandini Oza, who is herself a member of the Narmada Bachao Andolan. Nandini recorded oral histories of this movement, the movement that I think defined our times, to present through these long interviews, not only the movement to protest the making of the Sardar Sarovar Dam, but the disastrous impact it had on tribal people, drowning their homes and displacing and dispersing them. So, Keval Singh is someone I met recently, and I was really very honored to meet him. He's one of the old leaders, a tribal leader. We actually saw very little of these tribal leaders when the movement was going on, because the media would focus on Medhavatpur. So he actually talks here about the drowning of his home by the Nadi. And I'll first present the clip before I talk.
खरं नर्मदा एक देवी समान लोक मानतात, कारण नर्मदाची पूजा करण्यासाठी किंवा नर्मदा नुसतं पाहण्यासाठी सुद्धा देशातील अनेक ठिकाणावरून लोक आमच्याच गावाच्या समोर जलसिंधीपर्यंत येतात, किंवा जलसिंधीच्या समोर जिथं आम्ही अखाडा पुजतो, जे राणी काजल जी आमची देवी आहे, त्या देवीचं पूर्ण नामस्मरण आम्ही त्या अखाड्यावर बसूनच घेत होतो, आणि ते अखाडा ही नर्मदाच्या रेतीमध्ये आहे. तर इतकी पवित्र मानली गेलेली नर्मदा नदी, तर तिच्या किनारी आम्ही राहिलो. एका प्रकारे आम्ही ते नर्मदाची पुत्र आहे, मुलं आहोत असं आम्हाला वाटतं. जेव्हा माझ्या घरात जेव्हा पाणी आलं होतं नर्मदाचं सरदार सरोवरचंच पाणी, तेव्हा मी अक्षरशः पूजा केली होती की इतके खोल नदी, जिथं नदीपर्यंत पोचण्यासाठी किमान आम्हाला पाऊण तास लागत होता पूर्ण उतरून, तर ती नदी आज माझ्या घरात आली असं म्हणून मी तिची पूजा केली. म्हणजे एका प्रकारचं आईची भावना ही नदीला लागून होती. मी तर तिचं वर्णन करूच शकत नाही.
I'll stop this because I find this very moving that he is doing a puja as his house is drowning. And I remember in the original clip now he asks him, no, stop it there, I want to play the rest. So I think when she asks him, she said, she's destroying your home. And how could you do a puja? Saying, don't you realize it took us 45 minutes to go there? And she's come to my house today. And she hasn't come because, she wanted to drown us out. She came because people treated her in a certain way. She was helpless. So she's a person helpless. Oh, please.
आजही वडचिलसारख्या ठिकाणी मी आहे, कारण जे डोळ्यांनी पाहिलेले सगळे चित्र, ते चित्र आज दिसतात. एका प्रकार मी स्वप्न पाहिल्यासारखंच वाटतं, पण करणार काय? अखेर अशा प्रकारची जिंदगी जगण्यासाठी सरकारने मजबूर केला मला. त्या तिथं राहण्यासाठी, तिथं जगण्यासाठीच आम्ही इतकी 20 वर्षाची 22 वर्षाची लढाई तर केली. बाकी लढाई करून आम्हाला काही भेटलं नाही असं नाही. लढाई केली म्हणून जे काय भेटलं ते भेटलं, केले नसतं तर तेही भेटलं नसतं. पण अखेर नदी वाचवण्यासाठी हे सगळं करावं लागलं. जवळजवळ माझ्या घरात 8 दिवस पाणी राहिलं, पूर्ण घर डुबलं. पण नर्मदा आता माझं घर डुबवणार आहे तू, अशा प्रकारचं न करता अखेर तिची पूजा केली. नारळ फोडलं मी तिला आणि त्या पाण्यामध्ये आम्ही 8 दिवस काढले होते. असे नर्मदाचं वर्णन कोण करू शकतं? करणे मुश्किल आहे. देखो आत्ताच मी बोललो की नर्मदा पहिल्या
His memory of what he did when the Narmada, the river he considers his mother, the nurturing mother, came to, submerge his home, and how he recounts this actually opens up another world where the river is in distress. It is not her fault if she has drowned their homes. She has been forced into this course by human beings. How can it be her fault? Keval Singh's unusual response to the submerging of his home offers a deeper, reflective and meditative encounter with vulnerable nature and with the vulnerable nature of life itself, and how by opening up a deeper relationship between the humans and the natural world, we can understand something more. Nandini's interviews allows the tribal activists to speak in their own terms and indicate how oral history in India is often poised between two forms of orality, between speaking biographically about one's life and recounting a deeper knowledge of a relationship between the community and the natural world, offering us the opportunity to understand not just history and memory, but as Alistair Thompson, another oral historian, puts it, the humanity of our craft. That we are listening to, as human beings, to another human being. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I think I want to come to what Frisch, who is a public historian and an oral historian, reminds us again and again. That what is it that we can do? Are we just talking about a democratic redistribution of knowledge, or are we including all this to enter larger debates about what is history and what can history mean in our post-colonial world if we take that question further? What range of experiences and perspectives must we understand and include in order to move away from the colonial notion that history represents progress and an evolution of growth and development from one age to the next. Such perspectives can spiral between moments challenging the linear logic of history as progress. When Keval Singh articulates the community's relationship to the river, and to say that that is what has significance, that relationship cannot be wiped out, much like the way the making of the dam wiped out his home, his village, their temples and the forests. His memories hint at another world and another time. And with that, I want to turn to the last section of my presentation, which is called, What Time Is It in the Archive? What kind of encounter with time do we have when we enter the archives? And here my inspiration is this amazing archivist called Terry Cook, who was from Canada. And I don't know what it is about Canada, but it's produced these archivists who've been deeply reflective about their craft. And of course, Ranjit Chitrakar, the Pattachitrakar I've interviewed, who incidentally will be here at tea time today to sing some of these songs to us. And thank you, Ramon. Please. So, what Terry Cook says here is very interesting, that historians are often like tourists who come into the archive and visit it. Of course, it is one that they visit as tourists, passing through, focusing on their feeling views, but overlooking their surroundings and inhabitants and all what they do. That's failing to understand the country's real character and animated soul. So, in other words, I think tourists who come to glimpse the exotic landscape and they leave with a piece of that landscape as a photograph or as a photocopy in this case, which they can analyze, but they do not often look at the provenance of that archival document, how it came to exist within the archive and its relationship to other documents there. In an earlier chapter published in a book on Canadian studies, Cook had argued that traditional archiving was clearly influenced by Darwinian thinking and metaphors, where documents came into the archive as, and I quote, natural organic residues from administrative processes and then were kept in pristine order. I should return to Cook again, but right now I'd like us to consider the question, what time is it in the archive? A question that has particular resonance in India, where we move in and out of different time zones. The time of my great-grandmother's stories, which I began with, and the time of the virus, where time stood still as it were, but did it. So let's move to a song by Ranjit Chitrakar on the coronavirus. He is, as most of you know, the Pattachitrakars, a traditional scroll painter who sings mainly the stories of the Puranas. And these are stories of gods and goddesses. But in the 20th century, often turned to painting and singing about contemporary events, about 9/11 and tsunami. And then, when COVID left us paralyzed with the first lockdown, during that time, it was Ranjit who actually called to ask how I was doing. And when I could finally travel to Kolkata in November 2020, he visited to sing me the Corona part and sang it also to my mother, who was very fond of his singing. Not only Ranjit, both his sons have painted COVID, giving it their own interpretation. Okay.
নাম বলাবো
আমার নাম রঞ্জিত চিত্রকর পটের গান করছি আমি করোনা ভাইরাসের উপর গ্রাম নয়া পোস্ট নয়া থানা পিংলা পশ্চিম মেদিনীপুর ও জনগণ সবারই মিলে হোক সচেতন, ও জনগণ সবারই মিলে হোক সচেতন। দিনেতে উৎপন্ন হলো চারিদিকে রোগ ছড়ালো, দিনেতে উৎপন্ন হলো।
It's not very well recorded. It's shaking a lot. And I think he can sing it when he's here. But basically he talks about how this virus originates in China, and it comes here and what it does. But it's also about becoming aware of this virus. But when we started talking about what made him write this, he's very puzzled by this because he said, I have not seen this before. And when he was painting 9/11, Ranjit didn't hesitate to draw people who didn't have eyes, who were basically, he said, people who have died. In case of the COVID-19 virus, he refused to draw those who were dead. And he said that's because it will just generate more fear. We don't know. In fact, even I don't know if I were to get it, if my sons can see me at all. And this was, reflective of what, so it seemed to me that here he was, when he was painting 9/11, he was at a distance from it. Here he was in the middle of it, and he was reflecting more and more about what this meant. It's like this. And he begins to show us this understanding of time that cannot be just the time that as we see it. Next. So he says, that to understand Corona, you have to think about the yuga, the whole yuga. And so I asked him that, the Shastras talk about dhansha, destruction, and it keeps his mark, and this is Kali. So I said, what do you mean? Is Corona the Kalki avatar? And he says, well, there are different stages of Corona, and there are different things happening here. So this was really very, very interesting to me because he says you can understand it only in the larger dimension of time. If you move into mythical time rather than our everyday time. And I think this is some way in which it reminded me of the way in which memory and morality also connect to this larger time again and again. And I want to end here with talking about the different time, and this is just amazing that he talks about the two men coming to Yudhishthira, the eldest son of King Pandu, with a case. One had bought the other's land and soon after found a crop of gold in it. He wanted to return it to the original owner of the land, who was arguing that it really belonged to the man who had now bought it. They had come to Yudhishthira to settle their virtuous dispute. Just then, Yudhishthira was called away for a while. When he came back, the two men were quarreling furiously, but each was claiming the treasure for himself this time. Yudhishthira realized at once, that the age had changed and Kali Yuga had begun. So there's a huge shift of time, and this desire, shows us the way in which people behave towards each other. And I think that is where, when we look at the archives and we have all these voices, we can't really say this belongs to 1857. When Amritlal Nagar went around collecting songs of 1857 in UP, these were folk songs which had all kinds of other elements in it, as well as what happened when this rebellion was going on. So I think when we talk about the archives, when we talk about how will we archive, what is that time? keep this larger thing in mind that hours, months, seasons, years, and eons have their own properties and contexts. And this marks many of the narratives that enter archives. And I think to return to David Cook, I would say that he had been looking at, he was very self-aware of the kind of shifts that had happened, where you no longer thought that the archive should be grounded in the concepts of the state. Rather, archivists had to think more and more about public use, public policy, and one shouldn't think of social memory as something that is administrators' memory. It is something that is much larger, and that's why he says that it's not really, archivists are not, should start looking at what is it, what more comes into the archive. So what is that time in the archive? And more important than a production of records, transcripts, collections, articles, monographs, is the role we play, I feel, as facilitators of dialogue. Indeed, it is that fact that we facilitate dialogues grounded in experience with people who have been ignored by the traditional archives and who can offer us interpretative reflections on the past that makes our task so significant. Because only when we nurture these dialogues and journey with the community into our past can we reimagine archives and museums as spaces that resonate with conversations, recasting them as spaces for dialogues between individuals and movements and between memory and history. So I leave you with that thought that our task is much more than just collecting all this and then interpreting it in the old way that historians did. Thank you.